Hi, so this is the third lot of content for Soccer 3666, and this week we're looking at McDisneyfications, which is an interesting term. It kind of combines McDonaldization and Disneyization. I'm going to focus mostly on McDonaldization. It's the most well-known, I think, useful development of Weber's work in particular to think about some of the processes of globalization and the consumer culture as well. And then throughout the kind of second and third part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about some developments of these ideas that have kind of critically engaged with the idea of McDonaldization. Pointed out that maybe it's a little bit too one way about imperialism and sameness, and how there's maybe possibilities of hybridity and heterogenization going on as well. So this week, the key theory that we're looking at is McDonaldization. So to begin with, just, there's a kind of silly little clip of The Simpsons there that points out, I think a nice little illustration of what we're talking about here. Are things becoming more and more the same? And it's Bart walking through a mall there that, every shop seems to be turning into a Starbucks. Interestingly, the book McDonaldization of Society by Ritzer must be into about its 6th or 7th edition now. Every new edition includes, an updated version of what's going on. And there was one of the latest editions had a chapter called The Starbuckization of Society that was kind of drawing in the model of Starbucks into this McDonaldization model as well. There's also a link there to the excellent McLibel documentary, which is a little bit dated now, but it talks about how a politics of consumption throughout the 90s and early 2000s actually saw these huge multinational corporations have to change some of their behaviours and change some of their practices. And there was a very famous a court case in the UK that McDonald's took on these kind of two, nerdy working class protesters who were just handing out leaflets about some of the negative things that McDonald's were doing about their, food and obesity and about their waste and all this kind of stuff. And McDonald's tried to sue them, and they did sue them, but then it became a kind of PR disaster for McDonald's as it got reported across the world. So it's a really interesting documentary to think about some of the things I'm going to talk about throughout the rest of this lecture. So McDonaldization is George Ritzer's work. It's been a hugely successful piece of sociological theory. It's a term that's become part of the everyday lexicon. It's heard outside of academia. Ritzer essentially develops Weber's ideas of rationalization and the iron cage of rationality, and kind of updates them and gives them a different kind of subjective understanding in the contemporary world. So very influenced by Weber. You'll remember some of that from first year 101, hopefully. So I've left some of that there for you to have a look at, just to remind you what Weber was talking about. Basically, Ritzer takes Weber's ideas that will be trapped in this iron cage of rationality where everything will become the same, and uses the kind of example of McDonald's and the dominance of McDonald's as a form of the way that it's changed consumer culture because of its huge success, as a way of thinking about how that rationalization might look in consumer culture rather than just in the bureaucracy that Weber was talking about. So Ritzer points to 4 interlinking components of McDonaldization: efficiency, calculability, predictability, and control. And control there is through the substitution of human actions and interactions with non-human technology, how machines become to dominate that form of consumption in McDonald's more and more. This leads to what he calls the irrationality of rationality that I'll begin the second part of the lecture with. So 4 interlinking components. Now you'll see in the lecture's notes this week that I've left in some quite a bit of detail just for you to read, particularly in the second half of the second bit and the third bit of the lecture. That's because I think while the reading this week did a good job of explaining these things at a general level, there's a little bit more kind of contextual detail in the lecture notes just to go into a little bit more depth. So I'll just kind of touch upon what I've got there for you. The extent of McDonaldization, according to Ritzer, means that he argues, and this was back in the early 90s, when McDonald's was this huge global behemoth kind of expanding and expanding and expanding throughout the world, that the processes that it was using in terms of the fast food industry and the way that it was dominating the fast food industry would come to dominate more and more sectors of American society and therefore the rest of the world. So importantly here, what Ritzer wants us to think about is that how this kind of what he calls McDonaldization is not just about consumer culture, that this logic will move out of consumer culture and has moved out of consumer culture to become a kind of organizing principle of the way we consume food in general, the way the media works, the way education systems work, the way healthcare works. So for Ritzer, the success of this model and the four components and kind of how they would relate to, say, neoliberalism and capitalist profit would start to penetrate more and more dimensions of the world beyond just like food consumption. So firstly, there's efficiency, one of the key components here. And Ritzer argued that what McDonald's does is it sets up a system where we can kind of do things with the least amount of cost or effort. Now, from a consumer point of view, in terms of that seems like a good thing, right? Because things will be cheap and they're easy. But for Ritzer, this means that it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy happens here, that as this becomes more the norm, this will kind of spread out across society. So it's not just about going to McDonald's and being able to grab a cheap burger, that these things come to dominate the logic of more and more parts of society. So what this means is actually, even though it feels more efficient, the customer ends up doing more of the work. The customer has to learn new technologies, and we've got to learn more numbers and remember more numbers and all that kind of thing. So again, remember back to that the Weber idea, there's a dehumanizing process. So the efficiency here is done through things like drive-thrus and ATMs and microwave dinners, but these things then come to dominate us in many ways. They're efficient in that kind of least amount of effort sense, but really what they end up doing is it kind of make us do more work. So Ritzer argues that the dominant of these kind of so-called efficient systems may lead us clamoring for that which may not be in our best interests. So across the board here, you can see how this logic will move out, and I'll talk about that a little bit more after the four components. The second component is the idea of calculability, and this is the notion that quantity becomes to dominate quality, and certainly more is always better than less. And you can see this, how up until recent times anyway, that the soft drinks were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is the notion that more is always better and quicker is always better. So the calculability here, in terms of the way it moves out, you can see this in terms of how things are the Big Mac, the big gulp, the supersize, the triple, things. There's a kind of quantitative measure there. But like this logic of rationality and calculability moves out into other parts as well, in terms of, say, how 10 or 15 years worth of schooling just becomes represented in this one number, this ATAR, this quantity, rather than the experience of the education overall. It sees that in cultural forms that TV shows are axed because of less ratings rather than they're any good or not. So here this notion of calculability becomes another kind of dominant factor in society. This leads to this idea that we emphasize quantity, but what this means is things become more mediocre, according to Ritzer. In relation to that quantity, there's predictability. Ritzer argues that the McDonaldization of society means that we'll kind of know what to expect in more and more consumer positions. But again, this is a reinforcing logic that as we become to know what to expect more and more, we'll actually crave knowing what to expect more and more. We'll be less likely to pursue things, experience, texts or whatever that are outside what we already know. And this leads to things like, surprises and spontaneity being not very valued and seen as a kind of negative rather than a kind of, positive experience. For Ritzer, this leads to a kind of structuring our lives into kind of boring routines where we kind of go through things on autopilot, where we don't really kind of expect things out of the ordinary at all, and this leads to more boredom, even though we appear in pop culture and consumer culture to have more choice. So as things become more the same and more homogenized, we get kind of more bored and tedious with those things. And so he kind of points here out how there's a kind of formulaic thing that happens, so there's, huge best-selling novelists often pretty much write the same novel over and over again and just, change some of the details and the names in the cities or whatever. Now, if you go to kind of airports all around the world, they're pretty much the same. And certainly if you go to a McDonald's all around the world, they're all the same. So this leads to what he later calls the globalization of nothing. Fourthly, there's this notion of control, and this is the idea that the kind of machines we use to create that efficiency come to dominate us. And you can hark back here to some of the things that Marcuse was talking about, that as machines become used more and more in our lives, whether it's calculators or ATMs or microwaves or, self-serve checkouts or whatever, we're required to think less and less. We're required to interrelate with humans less and less. And this sees many of those kind of humanistic skills become increasingly redundant. And so Ritzer argues that this will lead to the possibility that more and more people will lose the ability to think for themselves. Our reliance on technology here will do that. You can see there's a kind of, dystopian kind of Big Brother kind of element to what's going on in this understanding. So they're the four components of McDonaldization. When I start the next section, I'm going to talk about what Ritzer argues this leads to, which is the irrationality of rationality.